Hello everyone, and welcome to another video on flight physiology and human factors. So this is going to be chapter 4 on hypoxia and hyperventilation, and this is actually going to be part 1 of a 2-part video series on this chapter because as you've seen from looking through the chapter, it's pretty long. So in the interest of not having a video that is almost 2 hours long, we're going to split it up into 2 different chapters. And the good news is that after 3 straight chapters of dealing with important but not necessarily exciting topics of human error, flight safety, the different types of errors, the history and discipline and need for human factors, we're actually going to get into some human physiology here. We're actually going to start talking about some science, which excites me greatly as a scientist myself, and I hope you will be excited as well. So our chapter objectives here are number 1, to understand the composition of Earth's atmosphere, including the atmospheric zones and the relationships between altitude, total air pressure, and the partial pressure of oxygen. We want to also understand the basic physiological mechanisms of ventilation and gas exchange, which collectively are called respiration. And these are going to allow a person to capture oxygen from the atmosphere so that that oxygen can be made use of by the body's cells. And then finally, this is going to be in part 2 of this video series. We will start looking at hypoxia, which includes not only the signs and symptoms of hypoxia, but different kinds and types of hypoxia, which can be caused by different things or can be caused by different disruptions in the life cycle of oxygen in the body. And then we'll also look at preventative and mitigating measures, how pilots can recognize when hypoxia is occurring, and what they can do to combat it. So we can recall from our previous chapter that we examined a lot of the history of physiology and aviation. So we talked about the 3 French aeronauts that took a hot air balloon way up into the atmosphere, well above the 10,000 feet threshold that we know you need supplemental oxygen above that. We talked about that. We talked about Wiley Post wearing a pressurized suit to go up into the atmosphere. So we're aware that there are challenges associated with ascending altitude and getting above 10,000 feet. So many of the challenges that were associated with climbing to high altitudes, even if we didn't exactly know the physiological principles behind it, aviators back then knew enough to know that there was a relationship between oxygen that we breathe and getting too high up in the Earth's atmosphere. So we've known about this for a long time, even if we don't know the specific reasons. And we also, in Chapter 3, we looked at a specific case study, the 1999 South Dakota Learjet crash, which claimed the life of pro golfer Payne Stewart, among many others. So in that case study, we saw that a cabin depressurization event caused everyone on board, even the pilot and the flight crew, to become incapacitated due to hypoxia, which of course is the lack of sufficient oxygen to the body. So what we're going to do in this chapter is we are going to critically examine the science and the physiology behind why the human body needs oxygen. Where is oxygen in the atmosphere? How much oxygen is in the atmosphere? What relationship is there between altitude and the amount of oxygen that is available to us? So let's start looking at that. First, before we do anything else, I want us to have an appreciation for biologically, why do our bodies need oxygen? We know that we need to breathe, but scientifically, why is it that we need to breathe? Why do we need to breathe oxygen? So all of your body's roughly 30 trillion cells, and of course with cells we're talking about components of our bodies that are much too small for us to see if we don't have a microscope available, but all 30 trillion cells in your body, whether those are brain cells, heart cells, muscle cells, liver cells, skin cells, etc., all of your cells need energy in order to function. Your cells, as you are going about your day, are performing important energy requiring tasks that are keeping you alive. So the energy that your cells use in order to function ultimately comes from the food that you eat, or in cases of hunger or starvation, energy that your body stores up, like the fat that you store up. So, either way, your cells are going to harness the energy in the food that you eat through a complex set of chemical reactions, metabolic reactions called cellular respiration. Okay? So, this chemical reaction formula that you're looking at here is a rough representation of the net achievements of cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration consists of dozens of individual chemical reactions that we are not going to get into in this class. But overall, what you are accomplishing here is represented by this formula here. So, to kind of pinpoint a few of the things that are happening here, the presence of oxygen, which you can see as one of your reactants here, this is absolutely required in order to maximize the amount of energy that is harnessed from the reactions of cellular respiration. Now, in green here, this is glucose, which is also known as blood sugar. Glucose here is depicted as the food molecule that you are getting the energy out of. So if you say eat a donut in the morning, that donut is going to have a lot of sugar in it. So your digestive system will break down the sugar in that donut into glucose, and that glucose will circulate throughout your blood. And that glucose that's in your blood is available to all of the cells in your body. So just in this example, if the cells in your body are using the glucose from that donut, the idea here is that in order to harness as much energy as possible out of that glucose that we got from the donut, we need to have oxygen present. And if we don't have oxygen present, we are not going to do a good job of extracting the energy out of that glucose. We're not going to do a good job of extracting the energy out of the food that we eat. And it's worth noting that even though glucose is kind of the popular example of the food molecule here, you can get lots of energy out of other things that you eat as well, like fats and proteins as well. It's worth noting that that donut that you eat, it not only has lots of sugar in it, it has lots of fat in it as well. So a donut may not be the healthiest thing to eat, but it does definitely have lots of energy in it that your body can use. So, like I said, your cells are going to harness the energy in food most effectively when oxygen is available to them. When oxygen is lacking, when your body does not do a good job of delivering oxygen to the cells of your body, or you stop breathing or whatever, if you're hypoxic, then your cells are going to manufacture about 18 times less energy than they otherwise would. When oxygen is not present, your cells can no longer go through cellular respiration. Your cells can still make a little bit of energy through a process called fermentation, but fermentation makes 18 times less energy than cellular respiration does. And for certain cells in your body, especially your brain cells, these cells cannot function on the energy that is made through fermentation. These cells have such immense energy requirements that only cellular respiration and the energy that comes from that can really suit their needs. So what you can appreciate here is that if somebody is affected by hypoxia and they are not receiving an adequate amount of oxygen, the cells in their body, the cells in their brain are having to make energy by fermentation, and that is not providing enough energy for those brain cells to function. Well, of course you can understand how a person affected by hypoxia is going to experience diminished cognitive performance. They're going to not recognize when altitude is dropping. They're not going to do a good job of piloting the airplane. They're not going to do a good job of thinking when they're in the cockpit when they are not receiving enough oxygen. So therefore, in order to pilot an aircraft safely, we need to make sure that everybody, especially the pilots, are receiving enough oxygen so that they can function at the best of their abilities. Okay, so we will get back to the concept of respiration in a little bit. Let's switch gears here real quick and talk a little bit about the Earth's atmosphere. In other words, the air that we breathe. The air that we breathe is a mixture of gases other than just oxygen. So when you go outside and you breathe, you're not just breathing oxygen, you're actually breathing a mixture of multiple different gases. You might be surprised to find that the primary gas that you are breathing is actually nitrogen, or N2. 78% of the atmosphere consists of nitrogen, 21% of the atmosphere consists of oxygen. So together that makes up about 98% of the Earth's atmosphere is just nitrogen and oxygen, and everything else is going to be a little bit of argon, a little bit of carbon dioxide, some water vapor, depending on what the humidity is like. But most of what you are breathing is nitrogen followed by oxygen, and then everything else is just in very low abundance. So the percentages that I showed you here are usually fixed regardless of what the total air pressure is, as long as you're in the part of Earth's atmosphere called the troposphere, which we will define here in just a minute. So those percentages are fixed. Whatever kind of air you are breathing in this part of the atmosphere, 78% is going to be nitrogen, 21% is going to be oxygen. So air pressure refers to the total force the air around you is exerting per unit area. At sea level, this pressure is defined as about 760 millimeters mercury, or 29.92 inches mercury. So the funny thing about air pressure is that there are lots and lots and lots and lots of different kinds of units that you can use. You don't have to use millimeters or inches mercury. You can use atmospheres or bars or pascals. There's lots and lots of different units of measurement for pressure. So on Blackboard, I uploaded a conversion chart that no matter what kind of unit you prefer, you'll always have the conversion factor you'll need to convert from one unit to another. So you might take a look at that if you don't prefer millimeters mercury or inches mercury and you want to convert to something else. That's a tool that you can make use of. So what we saw before back in chapter 3 when we were kind of mentioning it offhand is that as you gain altitude above sea level, the air pressure will decrease, and it will not decrease linearly, it decreases logarithmically. So here you can actually see a graph and a figure that shows you the relationship between altitude and air pressure. So in air pressure here, we're using a type of unit called millibars, and that is covered by the conversion chart that I posted on Blackboard. But at sea level, your pressure the atmospheric pressure is going to be about 1,000 millibars, or 1,013.24 millibars. So that is your standard pressure at sea level. So that would be equivalent to 760 millimeters mercury. But then as you start gaining in altitude, as you go from the right to the left, so altitude here being on the y-axis, as you start gaining altitude above sea level, you can see it starts looking like a linear relationship between pressure and altitude, but then it starts curving upward. So this is the kind of typical thing that you see with logarithmic relationships. So if you look at this commercial airliner that is flying up near the tropopause at about 30,000 feet or so, the air pressure is roughly 1/5 or less of what it was at sea level. So that total air pressure is something that we're going to need to consider here in just a moment when we start thinking about how much oxygen is available to breathe at sea level versus way up here at cruising altitude. So the atmospheric gases are actually not evenly distributed across all altitudes. So what we can see from this graph here is that if your total altitude is 164,000 feet, which is just an altitude that nobody is really ever going to be at unless you're an astronaut, 99% of the mass of the atmosphere, which again is just a mixture of gases, falls below here. Well, if you descend down to 53,000 feet, that is about a third of the way down to sea level. You can see here that that percentage does not drop down to 30 or 35%. It actually drops down to 90%. So even though you have dropped about 2/3 of the way down in the atmosphere, you have only dropped about 10% of the total amount of gas in the atmosphere. And then even at 18,000 feet above sea level, you still have 50% of all the air that is underneath that threshold here. So what this means is that the drop in pressure that accompanies gain in altitude, what that indicates is that there are much fewer air molecules at high altitude than there are at low altitude. And if we start looking at the atmospheric layers here, the atmospheric layers are defined based on temperature, and most flight operations are going to take place in the lowest part of the atmosphere, which is called the troposphere. So down around sea level, the temperature obviously is going to depend on the climate and everything. But as you can see that as you gain an altitude through the troposphere, the air starts getting colder and colder and colder and colder until you get to the tropopause. And at that point, you get into an isothermal part of the atmosphere, and then the temperature kind of starts moving back and forth because of the physical properties of things that you find above the troposphere, like the ozone layer, which absorbs a lot of solar energy, and things of that nature. So it's very interesting to talk about the different layers of the atmosphere if this were a physical science class. But since we are dealing with flight physiology, it's not really worth talking about anything other than the troposphere and the tropopause, because that is going to be where almost all flight operations are going to occur. You're never really going to ever have occasion to be any higher in the atmosphere than the tropopause, again, unless you are an astronaut. So it's worth mentioning that the tropopause is where the jet streams are located, and the temperature there is around negative 60 degrees, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this chapter obviously necessitates cabin pressurization if you're flying without supplemental oxygen. You need cabin pressurization not only because of oxygen issues, but because of temperature issues as well. So you not only have to pressurize the cabin, but you need to have a good heating mechanism as well. Otherwise, everybody on an airplane would absolutely freeze to death. So we can also define the physiological atmospheric zones of the Earth's atmosphere, and this is based on how the human body responds to different levels of altitude. First, you have what is called the physiological efficient zone, which runs from sea level to 10,000 feet. And the characteristics here is that a person can conceivably exist at this range of altitudes without really being too terribly affected by the altitude and the hypoxia that occurs. So you'll end up with some issues that are the result of trapped gas, like your ears popping, your sinuses getting clogged up, and things of that nature, but nothing too severe. There will be some mild hypoxia and fatigue that sets in above 5,000 feet, but generally speaking, the only cognitive aspect that's going to be affected here is your ability to see at night, which is something that we'll talk about again later. Above 10,000 feet, but below 50,000 feet, this is called the physiological deficient zone. It's possible to live and function at this range of altitudes, but not without supplemental oxygen. You cannot exist above 10,000 feet and try to breathe normally unless you either have cabin pressurization or supplemental oxygen that comes in a tank. So the hypoxia that you would experience in this physiological deficient zone would be so severe that you would eventually become incapacitated, and your cognitive function before that would be almost totally impaired. And then above 50,000 feet, this is called the space equivalent zone. Totally inhospitable to humans. You cannot you cannot even function up in the space equivalent zone unless you are wearing a pressurization suit like we saw Wiley post-war when we looked at that in chapter 3. So completely inhospitable to humans. The unprotected exposure above 63,000 feet, which is called the Armstrong law, or the Armstrong line, would actually cause body fluids to boil because of the drastic difference in air pressure versus the pressure of our bodily fluids. So you cannot exist in the space equivalent zone unless you are wearing a pressurized bodysuit. Okay, so let's start looking at the relationship between the air pressure, which we just saw is changing with altitude. So total air pressure decreases with altitude. So now we want to know what that means for oxygen. So we saw previously that the atmosphere is a mixture of gases, yet the air around us maintains a total atmospheric pressure of around 760 millimeters mercury at sea level. So that total air pressure that you're seeing right there, that 760 millimeters mercury, that is the pressure of the entire mixture of gases, nitrogen, oxygen, and everything else. So we want to look at Dalton's law, which states that the total air pressure is just the sum of all the individual air pressures, what we call partial pressures, of the individual gases that make up the mixture. So let's take a look at this. Let's say that your total atmospheric pressure, or PATM, is 760 millimeters mercury at sea level, which we know it is. So what that would mean is that 760 is equal to the partial pressures of each of the individual constituents of the total air added together. So that would be the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the total pressure, or the partial pressure of oxygen plus the partial pressure of argon plus the partial pressure of CO2, and then plus the partial pressures of all the other gases. But we'll go ahead and keep things simple and just keep it at these four for now. So let's say that you want to calculate the partial pressure of nitrogen. So how would you do this? Well, you have part of the equation figured out already. You already know that the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the partial pressures of all the other gases have to add up to 760. But another interesting and useful thing is that these partial pressures are actually based on the percentage abundances that we looked at earlier. So if you want to know what the partial pressure of nitrogen is, well, it's just going to be 78% of the total air pressure. So 0.78 times 760 would give you a partial pressure of nitrogen equal to about 593 millimeters mercury. So of that total atmospheric pressure of 760, about 593 of that comes from nitrogen's contribution. If you wanted to do the same thing for oxygen, you would take 760 and multiply it by 21%, which is the abundance of oxygen in the troposphere. So that would give you a partial pressure of 159.6 millimeters mercury of oxygen. If that is the partial pressure of oxygen in the air that you are breathing, you should be just fine in breathing and existing and living healthily. So the amount of oxygen you breathe, as we're going to see in our next example, is very much dependent on the total air pressure. So let's do that same sort of exercise, except this time let's look at cruising altitude, which is about 30,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, the total air pressure is going to be about 150 millimeters mercury. So again, the total air pressure, according to Dalton's law, is equal to the sum of the individual partial pressures of the constituent gases, so nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and carbon dioxide. So if you want to know the partial pressure of nitrogen, again, 78% of the total air pressure, that would give you a partial pressure of nitrogen of about 117. But that's not very interesting because even though nitrogen is the most common by far gas that you find in Earth's atmosphere, it's actually not terribly important in human biology. Our cells don't really use nitrogen for anything at all. But obviously our cells do make use of oxygen, and at a cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, your partial pressure of oxygen, which previously was 159.6 millimeters mercury, it drops down to 31.5 millimeters mercury. So if you're at cruising altitude and you do not have cabin pressurization and you do not have supplemental oxygen available, every time you breathe, you are actually obtaining far less oxygen than you were before. So that is kind of a problem. And we are going to see later on when we start talking about hemoglobin in the blood, this availability of oxygen is hardly the only problem. Altitude does not just cause problems with oxygen availability, it also causes problems with the ability of our cells to obtain oxygen through transport in the blood. So there are lots of reasons, as we are going to see, why high altitude is a problem for our body in terms of our abilities to obtain, transport, and utilize oxygen. So again, the idea of Dalton's law of partial pressures is that the composition of the atmosphere for each gas helps determine what the partial pressure is at that particular total air pressure. So again, nitrogen is about 78%. So if your total air pressure is 1,000 pascals or millibars, then 78% of that would be nitrogen, so that would give you a partial pressure of 780. For oxygen, it would be a partial pressure of 210, so 21% times 1,000 is 210. Everything else, 1%, so that would give you 10. So the idea here is that the individual partial pressures have to add up together to equal the total atmospheric pressure in much the same way that the composition percentages here, 78 plus 21 plus 1, have to add up to 100%. Okay, so let's start talking about respiration. The general term respiration refers to the process by which a living organism exchanges gases with its environment. There are three major types, one of which we have already mentioned. You have external respiration, internal respiration, and then the one we talked a little bit about before, which is cellular respiration. So we'll take a look at all of these. But in looking at these, we mentioned that this is exchange of gases with the environment. These respiration activities will always involve the exchange of the same two gases, which are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So these three types of respiration are all connected to one another. And what you will see for each type is that oxygen and carbon dioxide in every case will be exchanged in opposite directions compared to one another. So external respiration involves the exchange of gases between the air we breathe and the lungs. So external respiration very much represents our attempt to breathe and capture the air that we are breathing, capture the oxygen that we are breathing in the lungs. We're going to trap that air in the lungs. Internal respiration involves the exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood. So after external respiration, once we have that air trapped in our lungs, we want oxygen and carbon dioxide to move from that air into the blood and vice versa. And then with cellular respiration, this involves the exchange of gases between the blood and the body cells. So after internal respiration, where we move the oxygen from the air we just breathed and into the blood will circulate that oxygen around, and that oxygen will have to move from the blood into the cells of the body so that they can utilize it to produce energy from the food that we eat. So let's talk about external respiration first, which can also be called ventilation. The first thing we want to make sure that we understand is that the tissue of the lungs consists of thin membranous sacs called alveoli. They kind of look like little bunches of grapes if you've ever looked at a picture of them. So these alveoli, which you can kind of picture as being kind of like balloons, they will inflate with air when you breathe in, and they will deflate when you breathe out. So what ventilation really refers to is the mechanical process by which our bodies draw air into the lungs, which is called inspiration, and push air out of the lungs, which is expiration. So the lungs are connected to the atmosphere via a network of hollow pathways, which makes up the trachea, also called your windpipe. The trachea connects your oral and nasal cavities to a network of bronchi and bronchioles, and this creates a pathway for air to flow from your mouth and from your nose all the way down through your thoracic cavity and into your lungs. That way, if you draw air in from the atmosphere around you, that air will eventually go all the way into your lungs and inflate your alveoli. Similarly, when you breathe outward, air will flow from your lungs back the way it came and back out into the atmosphere. So the thoracic cavity, which you can see represented here, you can see everything inside your rib cages here, including your lungs. The thoracic cavity is surrounded by muscles such as the diaphragm down here, and then muscles on the side like the intercostals and the scalene muscles. These muscles, when they contract and relax, this changes the shape and volume of the thoracic cavity, and in doing so, it also changes the shape and volume of the lungs. And what we're about to see is that it is these volume changes that is going to cause mechanically air to be drawn into the lungs and air to be pushed out of the lungs. So we're going to look at another mathematical relationship here, which will help us understand the purpose of the ventilation process. Boyle's law describes the relationship between the pressure a gas exerts on its container, or you might just think of it as the pressure of the gas, and then the volume of the said container. So there are two kinds of pressure that we need to be aware of for ventilation. First is the atmospheric pressure, which is the air pressure of the air that is all around us, the air that we breathe. And then number two, the pulmonary pressure, which is basically the air pressure that's inside the lungs. So we'll get back to this in just a second, but essentially when we're deciding how the ventilation process works and in which direction, we are going to be directly comparing these two types of pressure to one another to see which one is greater and which one is smaller. So what Boyle's law ultimately says is that the pressure and volume of a gas are inversely related to one another as long as the temperature of the gas and of the container is constant. So imagine that you have a sealed balloon that is full of air. So that air inside the balloon is maintained at a particular pressure, and the balloon has boundaries that give a defined volume that the gas inside is occupying. If you take the balloon in your hands and you squeeze it so that now the total volume of the balloon has decreased by half, what's going to happen is that the pressure of the air inside the balloon is going to double. So this inverse relationship that we see with Boyle's law says that if you decrease the volume of the container, you are going to increase the air pressure. If you increase the size of the container, the pressure inside is going to decrease. So that is what we mean by an inverse relationship. If one goes up, the other goes down. So similarly, the opposite is going to be true. Expansion of the container will cause the air pressure inside to decrease proportionately. So what does this mean for the lungs? So here you can see each of our lungs, and then you can see our bronchi connected to the trachea right here. So the process of inspiring, which is us breathing in, this is going to involve your thoracic muscles, mainly the diaphragm, which is below the bounds of the lungs here. These muscles are going to contract, and what this is going to do is cause the thoracic cavity and the lungs to expand in volume. So the volume of the thoracic cavity and the volume of the lungs is going to go up. That's what the up arrow means here. You can see the boundaries of the lungs are going to expand outwards. That increases the volume of the lungs. But what we can see from that is because of Boyle's law, that is going to cause the pulmonary pressure inside the lungs to go down. Since the volume of the container went up, the air pressure inside has to go down. Similarly, the process of expiring is just the opposite. This is going to involve your thoracic muscles relaxing. That's going to cause the thoracic cavity and the lungs to shrink in volume and contract inwards. So that decrease in the total volume of the lungs is actually going to increase the pulmonary pressure. This is Boyle's law in action. When the volume of the lungs goes down, the pressure inside the lungs goes up, and vice versa. So ultimately, what does that mean for the breathing process? Well, in order to understand that, we need to combine Boyle's law with a new type of mathematical relationship, which is Graham's law. So what is Graham's law, and how does what we just saw with Boyle's law help us explain how air flows in and out of the lungs? So what we're going to see here is that it is the manipulation of the air pressure in the lungs that's going to cause air to flow. So I may have said Graham's law is a mathematical relationship. It maybe isn't so much a relationship, but it is the explanation for how air moves from one place to another. And ultimately, when we are breathing, we are trying to get air to move either into the lungs or out of the lungs. We want air to flow. So it's this manipulation of the air pressure in the lungs that is going to cause that airflow to occur. And what Graham's law states is that air will always flow from areas of high pressure to areas of lower pressure. So let's say we have a situation where the total atmospheric pressure, so this is the air pressure that's all around us, is 760 millimeters mercury. If the pulmonary pressure inside each of the lungs is also 760, then there's not going to be any airflow because air will only flow, according to Graham's law, if there is a difference in pressure. So air will only flow from high to low. It will not flow from same to same. But through the inspiration process that we saw before, expanding the volume of the lungs decreases the pulmonary pressure inside the lungs. So if we decrease the pulmonary pressure, this will create a pressure gradient and a pathway for air to flow. So when you take a big deep breath in, you are expanding the volume of the lungs and dropping that pulmonary pressure. And now the atmospheric pressure is the higher of the two numbers, and that air outside of your body will flow inward through your trachea, through your bronchi, through your bronchioles, and it will flow towards the lower pressure, which is the pulmonary pressure inside the lungs. So this mechanically is how we draw air into the lungs and inflate those alveoli, which is going to be a prerequisite for the next kind of respiration that we're going to look on down the line. So if we do this with inspiration, oxygen-rich air will flow from the atmosphere, which is at the higher pressure, down into the lungs, which exists at the lower pressure. So that is Graham's law. Graham's law tells us that air flows from high pressure to low pressure. And what we do with Boyle's law in the ventilation process is we take advantage of that inverse relationship between pressure and volume. We manipulate the volume of the lungs to decrease the pressure inside the lungs so that the air will flow. So this works the opposite way as well. If you're breathing outward with expiration, we relax our thoracic muscles that decreases the volume inside the volume of the lungs and increases the pressure, so that in these cases now the higher pressure is the pulmonary pressure. So that will actually cause air to flow out the other way. But in either case, Graham's law holds up because air is flowing from high to low pressure. So when you breathe in, when you breathe out, Boyle's law and Graham's law are the laws that are at work. So in this diagram from your textbook, you can actually see the pathways that connect the atmosphere to your lungs. And this consists not only of your oral and nasal cavities, which you can breathe in through either one. Both of these connect to your trachea or windpipe. Your trachea is continuous with your primary bronchi, which connects to both your left and your right lung. And then your bronchi deviate into secondary bronchi, bronchioles, and then finally the terminal bronchioles connect with those thin membraned alveoli, which are going to inflate with air, which is necessary because the alveoli is going to be where gas exchange with the blood occurs. And that is going to be the topic of internal respiration, which we will look at next. Each alveolus, which you can see here, is completely covered in small blood vessels called capillaries. So capillaries are by far the smallest and simplest of all the different blood vessels, and that includes arteries and veins as well, which are much bigger. So these capillaries completely surround and encapsulate the alveoli so that when we inflate those alveoli with oxygen-rich air, we can very quickly get exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air that we just breathed in and has just entered the alveoli and the nearby blood supply. So that is going to be how internal respiration occurs. So what we just accomplished with external respiration is we caused the alveoli to fill up with air from the atmosphere. That air that we just breathed in is very rich in oxygen, very low in carbon dioxide, and that's a good thing, okay? But the blood that is flowing through those capillaries that surround the alveolus, that blood is returning to the right side of the heart and then is going through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. that blood that is coming in is actually poor in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. So ultimately, our goal here with internal respiration is to infuse that incoming blood with the oxygen that we just breathed in and remove a lot of that excess carbon dioxide so that we can breathe that out. So what we're trying to accomplish with internal respiration is we want to infuse the blood with oxygen and remove some of that excess carbon dioxide that is in the blood currently. So once we capture the oxygen in the alveolus, we need to transport it across these membranes that you see here. So there's the membrane of the alveolus, there's the membrane of the capillary. We want oxygen moving according to these blue arrows here, and we want carbon dioxide moving according to these red arrows here. So once we get oxygen into the blood, it will be transported through the blood and eventually delivered to the cells of the body, which we know will use it for energy through cellular respiration. So how is oxygen and carbon dioxide going to move through those membranes? Well, don't think of the membranes of the alveoli and the blood vessels as being just brick walls. They're not brick walls that nothing can get through. Oxygen is actually a very small and nonpolar molecule, very much like carbon dioxide. They are small and nonpolar enough that they can actually diffuse right through those thin membranes. So you can almost think of these membranes as having like little tiny pores in them, even if that's not strictly true, but you can kind of think of it that way. Oxygen and carbon dioxide can actually move directly through the thin membranes of the alveoli and the blood vessels. But they won't do that automatically. They will only do it if the conditions are right. And what Fick's law of diffusion tells us about the movement of molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide is that they generally will only move in one direction, and that direction is dictated by what is called a concentration gradient. Molecules want to diffuse from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. This is actually very similar in principle to Graham's law, which said that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. Well, this is high concentration to low concentration. So the idea here is that oxygen exists at a high concentration in the air inside the alveolus, but at a low concentration in the blood coming through the pulmonary artery. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, exists at a high concentration in this capillary blood, but at a low concentration inside the alveolar air. So this is going to be what causes oxygen to move one way and carbon dioxide to move another way. It's because their concentration gradients are pointed in opposite directions. So let's take a look at that another way. So this is a figure that I put together myself. So this that you can see right here, this is meant to represent the alveolar membrane of one of our alveolar sacs. So with external respiration, we breathe inward, we fill this alveolus with inhaled air, and that air that we just breathed in should have a high concentration of oxygen and a low concentration of carbon dioxide. This blood that is entering the nearby capillary and is coming from the pulmonary artery from the right side of the heart, it has a low concentration of oxygen and a high concentration of carbon dioxide. So exactly the opposite of what we see in the alveolar air. So we mentioned that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse across the alveolar membrane and across the membrane of the capillary. Each molecule will want to diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Oxygen will move from the air into the blood. Carbon dioxide will move from the blood into the air. So ultimately what we accomplish here is we infuse the blood with oxygen to make it oxygen rich, and we remove some of this excessively high carbon dioxide into the alveolar air, so that when it comes time to exhale and expire, we are actually voiding the body and eliminating a lot of that excess carbon dioxide just by breathing outward. Okay, and we talked a little bit about cellular respiration before, but we'll go ahead and just kind of polish off this subject here. So, after internal respiration, which we just saw involves infusing the blood with oxygen that we just breathed in. So, at this point, the circulating blood through the arteries is going to have a high amount of oxygen carried in it. So the circulation of the blood will act to deliver that oxygen and other nutrients to the body's cells. So these, for whatever, we might just say these are brain cells or muscle cells right here. So we know that these cells require energy in order to function. So the blood is going to deliver the food molecules that they need for the energy, the oxygen that they need. So the blood is going to deliver key essential nutrients like food molecules, like glucose and the oxygen that we just captured via external and internal respiration. So what respiring cells are going to do, these cells are actually doing the metabolic process of cellular respiration. They are going to obtain glucose and oxygen from the blood, and in going through the cellular respiration process, they will emit and give off carbon dioxide as a byproduct. That carbon dioxide will then enter the blood, and then that now low oxygen, high carbon dioxide blood will eventually make its way back to the lungs, and that will again necessitate this exact process that you see here as well. So the very act of breathing is going to replenish the blood with oxygen that is consumed by these respiring cells and eliminate the carbon dioxide that is given off by these cells. So the last thing I want to talk about in part one of this video here is hemoglobin. A very vital component of the life cycle of oxygen in the body is hemoglobin. This is an iron-rich protein that binds, transports, and releases oxygen at key junctures in the blood and in the life cycle of oxygen in the body. So the reason why hemoglobin is necessary is because oxygen is not very soluble in water, and blood is a water-based medium. So therefore, if you want to actually infuse the blood with as much oxygen as possible, you need something to solubilize it. You need something to carry it around. Now, there is a little bit of free oxygen just kind of floating around and dissolved in the blood, but most of the oxygen in the blood, over 95% of it, is carried around by hemoglobin. And that hemoglobin is contained within red blood cells, which are also in your blood. Red blood cells basically are just big floating bags that are full of hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin is capable of carrying a lot of oxygen. So hemoglobin as a molecule has two major components to it. Number one is the protein component, which consists of 4 individual proteins that are bound together. 2 of these proteins are called alpha globin. So here's alpha chain number 1, alpha chain number 2, so that's alpha globin and alpha globin, and then 2 beta globins. There's beta globin number 1 and beta globin number 2. The other essential component of hemoglobin is called heme. Heme is a complex organic molecule that you can see represented here. You certainly don't need to memorize necessarily what that looks like or what any of this actually means. It's not that important for you. But what you do need to know is that at the center of this heme molecule is a coordinated iron atom. That's what the Fe is, okay? So Fe means iron. That iron atom basically magnetically attracts molecular oxygen. So without that iron atom there and without the heme groups that are within hemoglobin, hemoglobin would not be able to bind to and carry oxygen. But because the iron is a part of the hemoglobin, each hemoglobin can bind to and carry oxygen. And since each individual hemoglobin molecule has 4 heme groups, each hemoglobin can bind to and transport up to 4 oxygen molecules at the same time. So that's a lot of oxygen carrying power that your red blood cells have. So we can actually mathematically model and graph the behavior of hemoglobin and its muscle-containing counterpart, myoglobin. So myoglobin is not found in the blood. It is actually contained within skeletal and cardiac muscle, but it is a related oxygen-binding molecule in the same way hemoglobin is. So hemoglobin and myoglobin can both have their oxygen binding behavior described by what is called a dissociation curve, which is shown here. So the y-axis represents the percentage of hemoglobin or myoglobin that are fully loaded up with oxygen. If you want 100% saturation of hemoglobin, you would want all of your hemoglobin molecules to carry the maximum of 4 oxygen per molecule. Myoglobin, if you're interested, can only bind to 1 oxygen at a time. So the x-axis represents the partial pressure of oxygen, of free oxygen that is available to be bound. So what you can see with myoglobin as it compares to hemoglobin is that you can actually allow the availability of oxygen to get very low before myoglobin really stops binding to oxygen. But hemoglobin actually has a very unique relationship with oxygen in that it has kind of this S or sigmoidal shaped curve that indicates it is much more sensitive to the partial pressure of oxygen than otherwise myoglobin is. And that's actually going to be very important to how altitude affects this. So the idea here is that as altitude increases, as we saw with Dalton's law, as altitude increases, the total air pressure decreases and the partial pressure of oxygen decreases as well. Well, what we just saw with hemoglobin is that as your partial pressure of oxygen drops as you move from right to left, then the percent saturation of hemoglobin drops as well. So if this is your normal partial pressure of oxygen that you breathe at sea level, if you drop that down to cruising altitude, you can suddenly see that your hemoglobin is not going to bind to oxygen nearly as efficiently as it would have at sea level. So as altitude increases, your partial pressure of oxygen drops and hemoglobin can no longer bind to it effectively. This blue graph here represents the drop in altitude that you see corresponding to the total pressure of the atmosphere and then the percent saturation of hemoglobin. And then the red line is one of those dissociation curves for hemoglobin that I showed you, but it's kind of pointed in the opposite direction compared to what I showed you before because the x-axis here is altitude rather than the partial pressure of oxygen. So what you can see here is that in the physiological efficient zone, which exists below 10,000 feet, you can see that I think the axis here is mislabeled. I think this should be 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, and so on instead of 1,000, 2,000, and so on. But I think you guys are smart enough to figure that out. So in the physiological efficient zone, which is 10,000 feet and below, you can see that hemoglobin does a pretty good job of binding the oxygen up here. You get between 95 and 85% saturation of oxygen, which should be good enough to support the metabolic activities of your cells. But as you get into the physiological deficient zone, as you continue to climb altitude, you can see your hemoglobin experiences a very precipitous drop in its ability to efficiently engage and bind to oxygen. You can almost think of it as kind of greasing up your hands. If your hands are all oily and greasy, you're going to have a hard time hanging on to things. You're going to find things slipping between your fingers. You're not going to be able to grab something and hold on to it. It's very much like that with hemoglobin. When altitude increases, this is almost like greasing the hands of hemoglobin so that it can no longer hang on to oxygen anymore. So what we saw before is that as you gain in altitude and you get into that physiological deficient zone, it's not just an issue of oxygen availability, it's also an issue of being able to bind to and carry oxygen within the blood. Okay, so that is going to wrap up part 1 of this video on chapter 4. I thank you for your attention. Join us next time and we will finish up chapter 4 and we will talk about hypoxia itself, the different types of hypoxia, and some mitigation measures that pilots can take to prevent and combat hypoxia. Thank you so much and so long.